Welcome, everyone. I'm Michelle Gold, Board Chair at Holocaust Museum LA. It's a pleasure for me to welcome you to today's program, Building Bridges, the Pandemic Education Divide. Building Bridges is a monthly discussion series that brings together leaders of community organizations for a conversation about working toward common social justice goals. For today's discussion, we are absolutely delighted to welcome highly respected leaders from each of our 4 partner organizations. Michelle Sampson, founding board member of the Jewish Center for Justice, Michael Lawson, president and CEO at Los Angeles Urban League, Nora Navarrete Dominguez, board member of Hispanas Organized for Political Equality, and Nancy Yap, Executive Director of the Center for Asian Americans United for Self-Empowerment. Holocaust Museum LA brings you programs like today's discussion at no charge. So if you are enjoying our programs, we ask that you consider supporting our work by making a donation to the museum at holocaustmuseumla.org/donate, or better still, by becoming a member. For more information about membership and a complete list of benefits, please visit us at holocaustmuseumla.org/membership. And it is now my pleasure to introduce the moderator of today's program, Museum Board Member Dan Schnur. Dan is a professor at USC Annenberg School of Communications, UC Berkeley's Institute of Governmental Studies, and Pepperdine School of Public Policy. Dan currently presents a weekly webinar for the LA World Affairs Council Town Hall called Politics in the Time of Coronavirus. As one of California's leading political strategists, Dan has worked on 4 presidential and 3 gubernatorial campaigns. He served as the National Director of Communications for the 2000 presidential campaign of US Senator John McCain and was one of the chief media spokesmen for California Governor Pete Wilson. Dan, thank you so much for helping us create Building Bridges program and for serving as moderator today for another special installment in this series.
Well, thank you, Michelle, so much, not just for the very kind introduction, but for the tremendous leadership that you've shown for the museum. We're all very, very grateful to you, and we're thrilled that you're with us today. And I want to thank all of our audience for joining us as well for what I think is going to be very important and a particularly timely conversation about the reopening of California's public schools as we begin, emphasize the word begin, to move out of the coronavirus pandemic. And as Michelle mentioned, we have a terrific panel here today. For those of you who are with us regularly, I know you'll recognize Michael Lawson from the Urban League and Nancy Yap from Cause. But Michelle Sampson has been with us before from Jewish Center for Justice, and we're thrilled to have her back. But I must say I'm especially excited that Nora Navarrete Dominguez is here with us today, not just because of the important leadership roles she plays at HOPE, Hispanas Organized for Political Equality, but because she also works as a campus director at the University of Laverne, one of California's finest independent universities. And we think that her perspective on the educational challenges, both relating to the pandemic and more broadly, are going to be particularly helpful to today's conversation. So Nora, we're very, very excited to have you with us today. Thank you so much for taking the time. And I'm going to put you on the spot right away as we get started and ask you a fairly general question, which I trust you to take in whatever direction you think is most helpful. But as California schools begin to reopen, what are the greatest challenges we need to consider? Because as you pointed out to me before, it's not as if this happens with an on-off switch. It's a pretty challenging road ahead. So what are those challenges that we ought to be thinking about as we begin to move forward?
Thank you, Dan, and thank you, everyone. You know, we talk about students who tend to regress when they're out of school for longer periods of time. We usually refer it as the summer melt. And that's that period, you know, between You know, students are in academic mode all the way through year long, and then they have this break. Sometimes it's a break, you know, a few weeks, depending on the type of school district. Sometimes it's most of the time, and historically, it's been 3 months, you know, where students have this break. And the summer melt that we're referring to is that students tend to turn off academically because they're tired. You know, they've been working really hard. They've been, you know, at it, you know, trying to keep those grades up. And they tend to turn it off, ready for that summer break or whatever break it's going to be during the melt. So that's why we call it a melt, because they tend to lose a lot of that if they're not remaining engaged in summer school or different activities that are happening to continue their engagement in the academics. But historically, the summer melts happen for 3 months. And as we all know, this pandemic has thrown in so many challenges for the students. So now they had a year or academic year long of challenges that we have yet to even see the results of how this is really going to impact the students. But the students, you know, now, you know, that 3-month period is turned into a year and a half for students now, right? I mean, the students have been in a whole different, they've been thrust into this whole different mode, and we can't forget what the students are going through now. The students, you know, because these young people have been, man, I call it like a collective trauma they've gone through this past year. We're going to see the challenges really rise up. So I would say one of the areas that we're going to see that challenge is in the summer melt, which is spanned a whole year and a half.
Well, Nora, thank you very much. I mean, your original observations lead to all sorts of topics that hopefully we can dig into deeper as we go through the hour. But right now, I'd like to turn to Nancy Yap, who's with us again, happily, representing cause. And Nancy, I know you've thought a lot about these issues too, not just in terms of the types of academic challenges that many students face, but other types of societal and cultural obstacles as well that we need to be prepared to confront. What else should we be thinking? Obviously, the schoolwork is of critical importance, but what else should we be thinking about?
Sure, I think that first, thank you again for having me here. And sometimes I just build off of some of the themes too from our previous conversations, in that, you know, last time we did talk about the anti-Asian hate and incidents and crimes that have been happening in this past year. I think about that too, just in the broader, as Nora mentioned it, in regards to like a group trauma of just the anxiety and fear of these things happening and how that's going to show up in our schools as well. And so just really thinking through, like, the students have also experienced and seen a lot of inequity, seen a lot of even inequity amongst themselves and how it has played out in terms of virtual schooling. And so when they come back, like, how are our education institutions going to address these challenges of both mental health as well as the fear and anxiety of bullying that will come up in a very different way than it may have in the past, and that there's also a lot of what they're seeing in the news that is causing anxiety. I know that we're seeing in the Asian and Pacific Islander community an added anxiety around physical and other types of bullying because of what we're seeing nationwide, and then the concern that then translates over to the kids on top of anxieties of COVID. So I think for us, just how is that going to look as schools reopen in terms of resources for the students?
Well, thank you, Nancy. And once again, you make a very important point, that this is a logical continuation of the discussion we were having in our April program. And I think one of the things I've found is we've been doing this program, Michelle Gold, if you can believe it now, we've been doing this for 11 months now. We've done it for almost a full year. How much these conversations tend to flow together. And so, Michelle Sampson, I'd like to ask you, First of all, we're very, very happy to have you back. We were thrilled the first time you joined us, and we're very excited to have you join us again on behalf of Jewish Center for Justice. So Nancy talks about this challenge at a couple of levels. One more broadly in terms of emotional challenges and potential difficulties that young people face in this kind of situation. But she also talked more specifically about biases and prejudice. I'm wondering if you could take us a little bit further on the first of those two questions and tell us what you see as to what needs to be done in order to make sure that our children, the school children, are ready not just for the academic, but the emotional readjustment of coming back into the classroom after so much time away.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me back. I always really appreciate these conversations and being with such an esteemed panel. I want to pick up what Nora said. She talked about the collective trauma that these kids are going through. and as Nancy pointed out, from the social unrest they've seen in the past year or have experienced firsthand, the trauma of worrying about a caregiver getting sick, having to go to work, not having the luxury to Zoom it in. I think they've been isolated. There's a social emotional component to their development that I'm sure Nora would agree that could go hand in hand with their academic development that's been missing this year. And as Nora talked about the summer melt, a lot of these kids aren't going to get to go to summer camp, and their wealthier peers are going to be having experiences, and as we start to open up, they'll be far ahead. And these kids may be staying at home with limited access to broadband and no other kids to play with while their parents have to go back to work. So I think this collective trauma from a social standpoint, the isolation, the prejudice, the fear of getting sick or the fear of a loved one getting sick, we can't underestimate that. And I know we talked a little earlier about the governor's reopening budget. I think there's something like, I may not have this right, but about $45 million allocated to address the social emotional need or the psychological trauma. And I don't think that goes far enough. I'm not a mental health professional, but I even see it in my own kids, how that re-entry into school life and into social dynamics has been really challenging and can be really distracting from the academia. So I think that any reopening plan or any reform of the public school system, it would be a mistake not to put that social emotional piece into it.
Well, thank you, Michelle. And Michael Lawson, you've been with us for almost every one of the 11 months of programming, which means essentially we ask you to be an expert in every topic, regardless of what it is that we're talking about. But one consistent theme that I've noticed that's emerged from our conversations, and a point that you've made many times over the months, is when we talk about a particular challenge, whether it's COVID, whether it's about the racial and social reckoning that took place over the summer, whether it's the election season of the fall, you've reminded us fairly frequently over the course of the year that these aren't new challenges, but these are things that we faced in the past. And I know that when it comes to education, while COVID has exacerbated some of these challenges, most of these problems existed long before the shutdown came last spring, didn't they?
Yes, and first of all, thank you for inviting me back once again and with this distinguished panel. Yes, what this has done is put a magnifying glass on the issues that have been in our community for a long time. Our kids haven't had access to high-speed broadband, or if they did, they didn't have the proper tools to utilize it. Their caregivers, their parents are essential workers, which means that oftentimes they are, even outside of the pandemic, they weren't necessarily there to walk them through the homework each time, because they're working at night, a lot of them. But the fact of the matter is, what was a situation that was untenable then has become even more so. And the time that has been lost for the minority community in Los Angeles, the students, is going to take a long time to catch up. This is not a situation where, just an additional summer school session will make up the difference, especially for those kids in the younger grades. I'm told that up until the third grade, you're learning how to read. Once you hit the third grade, you're reading to learn. So if you don't hit that third grade level, you're going to be struggling as you go through the rest of your grades. And that gap that doesn't exist in the more affluent areas of Los Angeles is going to widen unless we're very deliberate about making it up. We've been talking about making up this gap before, and organizations like the Urban League and organizations that are represented on this panel, we have always been involved in enrichment of the educational system. But now we have to do it on a larger scale because the gap is so much wider. I don't even think we understand how wide the gap is. I'm reading articles about how students who were otherwise doing rather well, but now that they're not engaging through the internet as they would in an in-person situation. Their parents, other caregivers are not there to, these are kids. You gotta ride them and make sure that they're doing the right thing. And it's, we first have to figure out how much damage has been done and figure out what we're gonna do to change it. But this is a long-term situation that we have to look at right now and start figuring out what we're going to do to make this up. I hear a lot of positive things coming out of the Biden administration about the utilizing community colleges a little bit more to help bridge that gap with free community college for these ideas are good, but we have to start implementing them right away.
Michael, I'm going to stick with you and follow up because what I hear you saying, I think makes a lot of sense, which these aren't new challenges, but there's probably at this point, there's a new urgency given what we've experienced over the last year plus. So before I ask Michael the next question, I'm going to remind our audience that you're able to ask us questions too. And if you're willing to place questions in the Q&A function that Zoom provides, I'm more than happy throughout the conversation to make sure that our audience addresses as many of your questions and concerns as the conversation continues also. So Michael, just to follow up on next steps, and I realize this, you've correctly identified a very, very broad set of challenges for us to take on. But there's one thing in particular that the Urban League is doing with some community partners that I think is really particularly impressive in this area. And I wonder if you could tell our audience a little bit about the work you're doing on the tutoring front to make sure that these kids who are more at risk have the additional academic support they need in order to succeed.
Well, thank you for that. We're kind of in an all hands on deck type of situation, but we need to supplement the teachers that are doing as good a job as they can with the number of students that they have responsibilities for, and it's so we can't just rely on them to do all the things that we need that need to be done. So one of the things that we're doing is working with local colleges to ask them to provide to ask the student body to act as tutors for these students to supplement what the teachers are doing. And we're in the process of putting that together. They're going to get work study, payments for doing so, and understand that this is something that will be necessary for a long period of time. Beyond that, there's another program that we have in place. It's called Tutoring, where we ask individuals to interact with kids who are in the first and second grade and just read to them to supplement what the students are getting in school. Because as I mentioned before, up until the third grade, you're learning how to read. But if you don't know how to read once you're in the third grade, if you can't read at a third grade level in the third grade, you're missing out, because at that point, you're reading to learn. And so we have to make sure that our kids are at or above that third grade level once they hit the third grade, in order for them to manage the rest of the academic sessions that they have coming up through high school and college. So we're expanding both of those programs, and the impact that they have on these kids is just wonderful. It's just outstanding. But there's so much that needs to be done. The number of tutors that we need is quite frankly infinite. We'd love to have one per student for every student in our community, but this is the type of work that has to happen, and we need an all hands on deck situation for this. And it's not a short term. We need commitments that will follow these kids all the way through.
Michael, if I can just ask you one quick question, just for the benefit of our audience. First of all, on the tutoring front, if either USC or Pepperdine are not involved, let me know, and we'll make sure this happens. I've heard this effort referred to as a tutoring Marshall Plan, and I can't think of a better way of describing it. But quick clarification for our audience members who may or may not be in a position to tutor, but I have to imagine that some of our audience members would have an interest in reading to some of these young kids. Is this reading program something that can be done online, particularly during the COVID?
As a matter of fact, it is all online. The Tutor-Mate program is an online program, so that you have a set time when you are talking with the kid that you're assigned to, and you're reading with them online. So it's a wonderful program. We're looking to expand it. We need as many people as we can to participate. And the only skill you need is to be able to read at a third grade level.
All right, well, I've just got that one down, barely, so count me in. I'm going to ask our amazing Harmony Barker, the museum's brand new program director, who's absolutely terrific, if she'd be willing, either in the chat box to post the web address for the Urban League, or if it's easier, Harmony, to send out an email to the participants, to the audience members afterwards. So anybody who does want to get involved in this really exciting program has the ability to. Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Harmony.
Oh, thank you.
Michelle, Michael talked about the tremendous educational inequities that exist between young people in different circumstances. But I know, in addition, you and I have talked about other types of inequities, the digital divide, the inequities in terms of technology, the divisions in terms of socioeconomic status and learning support that parents can provide. What did we learn during the pandemic about our public school system as it relates to these inequities?
I mean, I think not to put too fine a point on it, but I'll echo what Michael said. We learned that this has been going on for a long time, but the pandemic, it laid it bare, and it forced us to look at it, just in the way that video of George Floyd forced us to look the brutality in the face, we have to look the public education system in this country in the face. And I think we've been saying for decades that it's inadequate, but now we can't look away from it. And I agree with Michael. I think the Biden administration is doing some positive things to address the inequities. I think I really like the messaging that the infrastructure plan is also broadband, because a lot of these kids did not have access to broadband and therefore couldn't Zoom or couldn't do research for their projects and so forth, or connect with friends and fellow students. We're also learning that a lot of schools have lead in their pipes, and you know, we're worrying about their mental health, their academic capabilities, and their physical health is at risk as well. So it's refreshing to see some of these root causes being addressed, but it doesn't go far enough. And so I think as I think everyone on this panel and all our participants are activists in some way or another. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us to keep pushing that boulder up the hill and try to impact change, because the status quo is not good enough.
Thank you, Michelle. And Nora, I'd like to bring you back into the conversation, because these inequities exist not just on a personal or family level, but more structurally in terms of widely different, and particularly in terms of widely different levels of financial support available to our public schools. On one hand, I know that the state of California requires every school to require the same amount of public funding. And for reasons we're not going to be able to get into today, sometimes that ends up being the case and sometimes not. But those broader and socioeconomic inequities mean that some schools need more help than others. And it's a real struggle to make sure those schools and the teachers and the parents and the kids in those schools get the additional support they need. Can you tell us a little bit about that aspect of the challenge?
Yes, absolutely. So we're all referring to that it's not going to go away overnight, right? And it's going to take some time. So schools and working class communities have less access to resources, and many of the parents, you know, are essential workers, and students haven't had less academic support during this time frame. I mean, you're talking about homes that have multiple children, in many cases at home. They're all trying to log in. The resources, maybe they got a Chromebook, maybe they got a laptop lent to them, but they don't even have the internet and the broadband access or adequate access. So, you know, you have these parents who are home now who are having to fill in the roles of being a teacher, which in themselves, they're also trying to log into a Zoom. So you have this whole dynamic happening, you know, in the homes, and sometimes parents don't even have, you know, they've been out of school so long themselves, and, you know, they don't even have the subject matter to even help with students. And we're finding out that many of the schools, the teachers are under, you know, a lot of strain as well. So sometimes the teachers, you know, is having a hard time managing the Zoom. I mean, it's just challenge after challenge that's happening. So we must re-examine how resources are allocated to make sure the schools and at-risk communities have the support they need. One of the areas that the pandemic shed the light on is the imbalance of resources, for sure, in many underserved communities, especially in the communities of I live in Kern County, and we have many rural communities. And so across the nation, there's many rural communities that have even less resources out there. So this is an area that, you know, we really need to embrace, that it's going to take time, you know, to really support these students. It's not just flipping the switch and having them go back to school and pick up where they left off. I mean, that is something that we just, all of us collectively, in the classroom, out of the classroom, in the homes, social services, it's going to take all of us to really get these students the support that they need in order to, I don't even think they'll ever catch up. It's just a matter of getting them the support that they need to be able to move forward. And that's going to take resources, and it's going to take making sure that every community has the resources that they need. So I won't get into the area where you started to go to. It's very tempting to when it's talking about resources and state mandates and things like that. We all know there's still many, many communities who don't have the resources that they need.
Well, let's agree that we'll come back and have that conversation about resources in a future program, because frankly, it's important enough and complicated enough. It could take up the entire hour plus. But I think you raise a great point, Nora. In my classes at all three of my universities, I have students who are fourth and fifth generation college students and college graduates. I have other students who aren't just the first in their families to go to college, but the first in their families to finish high school, or the first to attend public school in this country at all. And I hope on at least one point that you're wrong, that we can eliminate that gap. But as each of you have mentioned in different ways, there's a lot of work to be done on a lot of fronts in order to do that. So Nancy, because you're my friend and I like to do this to you, I always enjoy asking you completely unfair questions. So we've talked about the student, we've talked about the family, we've talked about the school. But I think one of the other things we've learned, and I know one of the things that you believe we've learned or been reminded of from the pandemic, is the challenges that exist for the entire community, and particularly some communities whose families and whose children face the kind of additional challenges that the other panelists have talked about. What kind of challenges does this create for our communities?
So one thing, I think that comes up for the Asian and Pacific Islander community that I think it impacts a lot of immigrant communities overall is language access. We're also talking about trying to keep students educated at a certain level with all of these different things going on. But if we add a layer, I think Nora just mentioned of like, if we think about first, or of who's in the home, like all the people trying to get online, all of the people who are working, being parents that are also teachers, but adding a layer, Dan, to what you're just saying is like maybe not just that they're with a large population of immigrants in the Asian and Pacific Islander community, they haven't been in the public school system here. They may not know what is being taught in the classes. That doesn't mean they don't know the information. There's just a difference in some of the language. And so how do we also change where those inequities are of expectations of having people, parents also be teachers as part of like a overall system, but really thinking through where language access is important, how a lot of students may not have that kind of support at home, and how to provide it. And I think I was actually taking notes, Michael, about your program, and I think it's just how do we connect people so that students get those resources, but also recognize that in order for some of these communities to be able to help their kids, there also has to be an acknowledgement that there's a lot of different languages, a lot of different communities speaking a lot of languages, and that in order to be able to be part of that system, we also need to have access to it.
Well, I think it's so important, Nancy, and you and Nora both addressed it in slightly different ways, but it's one of the things that I see with my students as well, particularly those who are first generation. And I always tell them, I said, look, just remember, your parents are always going to be the ones who can give you the answers to the most important questions you have about your life, about your future, about the most important things. But on the in-between stuff, which class to register for, how to form a study group, how to do an internship, and those sort of in-between things, let us know how we can help. But just remember, on the really big questions, your parents are the ones, who will always have those answers for you. And for the rest of us, it's just filling in the in-between, filling in the blanks. So Michelle, we've talked about everybody's role in this, the students themselves, the teachers, the schools, the communities. What can we do? What can those of us who are participating in this conversation who want to help meet the challenge that Nora articulated just a couple of minutes ago, to help these young people get caught up after everything that they've been through, not just over the last 14 months, but over the inequities they've been asked to overcome through the course of their educations? What can and should the rest of it, what can and should all of us could be doing to help?
Well, first of all, I think everyone on this Zoom should sign up at the Urban League for TutorMade, and I know I'm going to be doing that. And I'm wondering if you would take middle school students, because I think my son would be interested as well. And I think, you know, the more we learn about organizations doing the important work, the on the ground work. Look, when you look at this or you dive into the governor's budget on how we're going to reopen and serve these kids, it's very overwhelming. And any kind of systemic change feels very overwhelming. I mean, how are we going to do this? But if you can connect with folks like the Urban League, and I apologize, I don't know other organizations, but I'm going to do some research and I'm going to get involved. And I think that's where I always put my hat on, is how can I be an activist? How can I engage? Certainly parents who are stakeholders in the public school systems need to show up, have their voices heard, know what's going on, understand the budget, hold the people in authority, hold their feet to the fire. But on the micro level, doing what you can in your community, like reading to children, I mean, it's so simple and so rewarding, and it would have such a huge impact. So I think it's incumbent upon all of us. So we're obviously all here because we care and we're interested and we're concerned to connect with those opportunities and locally in our community. Oh, you're muted.
There we go. Michelle, I couldn't agree with you more. And I was agreeing with you even while I was on mute. But I think it's exactly right. And it's a great reminder for all of us that none of us individually needs to change the world, but you find a way to make a contribution. And ultimately it helps these kids get to where they deserve to be going forward. Michael, you made a couple of points earlier that I'm really eager to come back to. You said there's no immediate answer for what we're facing with. And what you said almost in passing, and I'd love it if you'd address it further, is that in addition to the emergency needs, that what's required is really a more fundamental reassessment of how we provide public education for all public school students, but particularly for those in more disadvantaged circumstances. What does that kind of reimagining look like?
Candidly, it doesn't take much reimagining at all. I look at the sports industry. While we're struggling with how to get kids in our communities through high school and into college, and we talk about the lack of resources, we talk about lack of this, lack of that. Meanwhile, the NBA, the NFL, the baseball, they're able to recruit these ultra talented kids into sports. And how do they do that? They start at the elementary school level. They are recruiting kids early and often. And what are they doing? It may be difficult to get a kid to study trigonometry, but you ask him about the physics of shooting a 3-point shot, they know it. Why? Not because they're innately better at this than anybody else. It's because they spent more time doing it than anybody else. So I mention this because it's a function of what we want them to focus on and how we get them to want to focus on it as well. As long so it's when I look at that line of activity, and I see how eager these kids are to get involved, to learn the ins and outs, not just the physical part about the sports, but the intricacies of whatever sport they want to learn. These kids are bright, they're talented, they're eager, they want to grow up. And if you take the elements that get them interested in sports and turn them into tech, they will be all over it. this generation, they have, they're talented, they're smart, they know how to, if something's wrong with your computer, find a 9-year-old and they'll fix it for you. We need to figure out a way to get them, to energize them. And yes, the teaching needs to be done, the tutoring needs to be done, the focus needs to be done. But the other part of the equation, when you think about it, is that when it comes to sports, we're not just relying on one teacher dealing with 30 kids. There are a lot of people around supporting them and getting them to where they want to go. And the other part of it is that as parents, we need to say that we need to reward them for getting those A's, as well as reward them for hitting those 3-point shots. So it's the entire community has to be involved in this. The entire community has to be forward facing on this. And I am nothing more than an optimist in terms of what we can achieve, because I've seen it happen. The kids in our communities are some of the smartest, some of the hardest working kids that you will find anywhere. They need to be directed, and they need to get a sense of not just what this education can lead them to, but it's letting them know that this is something that they can do. And because all it takes is time. All it takes is focus. All it takes is an adult standing over their shoulder saying, you can do this. I've seen it in sports. I've seen it in tech. I've seen it in all kinds of areas where the support that they need, when they get it, they blossom. We have an opportunity here to redirect our efforts to a necessary situation where we just have to bring more people into this session and not just rely on the teachers and the teachers' aides, and give them the support that they need in order to do this. I'm excited about what the support that we're getting, that the Urban League is getting, that other organizations are getting from people just like you. But it's going to be a long task. I'm not sure that I answered the question that you asked, but it is so important that we do this, that we make up this lost time, that we get them excited about becoming the people that we know that they can become.
Well, you did it, for the record, Michael, you did answer the question and then some. But I think it's such an important point you made. What do we know about young people? Like all of us, maybe to an even greater degree, they thrive on positive feedback and on encouragement. And if they get that kind of encouragement, not just for scoring a goal or making a basket, but for doing really well on a test or a paper, I think your point is exactly right. Nora, let me come to you, and and in just a few minutes, we'll come back to more immediate challenges. But to build off of Michael's last point, one of the things I was struck by our conversation when you and I first spoke is you reminding me about the long-term consequences of all of this work. Not just the idea of making the schools work better now, but what that means, not just for the students, but society going forward. The long-term economic impact, the long-term leadership impact, what these young people can accomplish if we do right by them now, what that means for the future, for them and for their communities.
Yes, so this is not just about the schools, right? I mean, this whole, thousands and thousands of students that have gone through this, and I'll refer back to the collective trauma. These are the students who are our workforce for the future. They're our future leaders, you know, and they have, they need the support system, you know, in place right now in order to be able to understand that this was temporary, you know, that this pandemic was something that interrupted their life. It disrupted everything on every level, in every home, in every community. It was a disruption, but it was a temporary disruption, and that they can still have the future that they can write, you know, and it's going to help, it's going to need all of us collectively to ensure that they have that opportunity to feel empowered again, to take back their control over their future, you know. So, you know, it's just, you know, it's just so, I'm so excited to be starting to come out, back out of this and get around people again, little by little. And you mentioned something that's very important, that students thrive off of that positive reinforcement. And I remember I just went to, I had a friend that just turned 90, and I'll share this really quick. And she wanted to go to a winery, and it was safe in the community that we're at, and everything's fine. And that was my first outing in the year and a half, because I've been very, very careful. And I can't even tell you or describe what that felt like, being around others. And I didn't even know, you know, the folks that were in the room. But that's what happens. And we need to get our students in that environment. We need to encourage them to get back around people. And we need to model that, the safety, you know, that it's safe to do that, you know, when we have all the guidelines and we can't get back out. But we need to model that, you know, for the students, so that they can get back into this state of thriving, not just surviving, you know. So that's what I would say to that.
I think that's exactly right. And I will say, for the record also, just like all of us indicated our interest in volunteering to help Michael and his team at Urban League with the online reading program that they've pioneered, I will volunteer, and I suspect the rest of us will too. If you have any more 90-year-olds who want to go to wineries, count us in. We're more than happy to do that one. We're more than happy to do that one too. Nora, I want to stick with you for a minute and go back from the future to the present. I know that's where we started the conversation. And actually, before I do though, I just want to remind our audience is, as I said earlier, we've got about 10 minutes left. So if any of you have any questions that have come into your mind over the course of this conversation, by all means, please feel free to type them into the Q&A function that Zoom provides us. And I'll do my best to make sure that those questions get asked to our panel before we wind up at 12 noon. Over the course of the months, some of the most interesting questions, I think, come not from me, but from our audience. So please feel free to weigh in. But I do have a question that I'd like you to address, Nora, coming back to the present. There was an article I saw in the LA Times this morning that talked about the relatively small number of students who are returning to school either full-time or on a hybrid learning basis, even at those schools where that's available. And we touched on this a little bit earlier, but obviously a lot of parents, particularly in more underrepresented communities, have had real reservations about their children returning to school in person. And I'm wondering if you can tell us what you think should be done and can be done to make sure those parents understand how important it is to give their children the chance again. And I know we've got some grandparents who join us each month also. So maybe those grandparents can lean on their children to get their grandchildren back into school too.
Yes, so it starts with whatever role model and guardian they have around them and at home, and who's the most influential on them, you know, every day that they're around. They have to be assured first that it's safe, you know, to go back in school. Because they're not going to be, you know, if they're talking to family members or they're on the phone and the students I mean, the kids are all hearing this on a daily basis. And so what's being projected out, if it's anxiety and nervousness and not really understanding maybe what the vaccines are all about, or, all these things that are related to, to a safe return. So first we need to assure parents and guardians that it is safe, and we need to continue to educate our communities with this and get the information out in whatever language and whatever. If we have to go out, a lot of the sites right now, the vaccination sites, are having to switch gears quickly because they need to go mobile and get out into the communities to get people vaccinated. So the same thing with the education for these individuals. We have to communicate that it is safe so that they can turn around and influence those students that are in their homes. So I would say the communication and how we go about it at this point forward is really important to make sure that people feel safe and that they can turn around and model that and instill that into their student or into their children at home.
Nora, thank you so much. And I'd like to put the same question to Nancy up. But before I do, Nancy, as you might see, we have a question in the chat box. And I think it's a really, really smart one. I know you touched on this earlier, but the question, as you can see, this is: what ideas can you suggest in terms of mental health, bullying, bias, and prejudice? What steps can be taken to address those concerns, to make sure these children feel safe and feel comfortable returning to school, and that their parents feel comfortable putting them back in their environment too?
Sure. I know I talked a little bit about language access, and I think what Nora mentioned about feeling safe and having the parents also understand what that looks like is key, because you have to feel comfortable going in. I think also it's recognizing just the cultural differences in our communities and how we communicate in relation to some of these issues. Oftentimes in the Asian and Pacific Islander communities, we talk about how mental health is a bit of a stigma to even talk about. And so if that's true, how are we even going to know that we need help? There's also elements of, I would say, pride that come through across the board, where we don't want to admit we need something and how good or bad something is, because you want to seem like you can do it yourself. And I think that translates to our kids as they see us try to be those independent folks. And so on one hand, when Michael was talking about sports and starting at an earlier age, I think about how excited like my nephew is about talking about, interestingly, the Titanic. I don't know what it is about the Titanic, but he loves it. He could draw the whole ship from memory. I was like, what is this? And but just that excitement about learning something, and then all the things he learned because he loves the Titanic. How do we like make education fun for a long period of time, but also make it acceptable, or find ways to meet communities where they're at in terms of asking for help? Cultures of bullying and mental health. On one hand, we say kids have to learn how to defend themselves. And then on the other hand, we're saying like, and then there's this culture of not snitching, which is its whole other universe. But how do we find another solution around mediation, around checking in with students so that the bullies are getting support too? There's something happening that's triggering these things. I think that also translates into larger society as well. There are lies being told to our community, but there's also a lack of access to help. And so how are we supposed to address mental health and bullying when we don't even know where to go for help?
Well, thank you, Nancy. And Michelle, I know you've thought a lot about this also. So part of the reopening is logistical and health and safety questions, but a lot of it is reassuring and encouraging both students and parents that how important it is to take these steps forward, isn't it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I just keep thinking, right now in Los Angeles in the public schools, kids are going back to school for maybe 2 hours a day. So for it's not full time yet. So for parents who work, how are we supposed to do this? So I think that's another barrier to entry. And while it's great and the kids are excited, it's not enough. And I hope by September or August rather, things start to feel more normal with full time. We also have situations I saw in the news where anti-maskers, anti-vaxxers are harassing our students on their way to school. I think, creating school as a safe place and not a political minefield, we need to do a better job of that. Also, what Nancy said really struck something to me. I have a middle schooler. We're going through a lot of that, those growing pains and bullying and that sort of stuff. And I think teaching our kids to stand up and be allies. If you see something, say something, maybe creating that kind of a culture. And I think some kids are starting to do that. Like, it's not cool to say that. And so they're to try to encourage the helpers and encourage the allies, I think will go a long way. I don't know if that answered your question directly, but it's a lot to think about.
It certainly does. I don't know why everybody thinks that they're not answering my questions, but everybody certainly is, again, and then some. But I think you each make a really important point. I work with an organization called Beyond Differences. And in addition to the 4 terrific groups that we have here today, Hope and Cause and Urban League and Jewish Center for Justice, they don't like the term bullying at Beyond Differences, but they address exactly the kind of concerns we've been talking about. And while they run several different programs, the one that originally captivated me when I first heard about them was a program they run for middle schoolers, because they've decided that's the optimum age to help young people understand that, as Michelle correctly put it, that there's certain types of behavior that are expected of you. Kids who are younger aren't quite ready to grasp that yet. Kids who are older are getting a little bit more set in their ways. But the program they run for middle schoolers is simply called No One Eats Alone. And the whole premise of the program is that when you go into the school cafeteria and you see somebody eating by themselves, what the cool kids do is they go and sit down with that young boy or that young girl and make them feel welcome, as opposed to sitting at another table. And just the little steps like that can be the very beginnings of the type of outreach efforts that each of you have been talking about. As is usually the case, I could easily and happily continue this conversation for another hour or hours, but Harmony would get very, very upset with me if we did. So instead of going with my instincts, I'm instead going to thank our panelists, Nancy Yap from Cause, Nora Navarrete Dominguez from Hope, Michelle Sampson from Jewish Center for Justice, and Michael Lawson from the LA Urban League, for just a fascinating and really, really important conversation. I also want to thank Harmony Barker, our brand new program director at the museum. I want to thank Michelle Gold and Beth Keene and the entire leadership team at the museum. And most importantly, I want to thank all of you who joined us for today's conversation. We'll be back here next month on the first Wednesday in June for a conversation about some really important public opinion polling that Hope and Cause and Urban League have done on questions relating to discrimination and to race relations in this country, another survey in a series that's been going on for almost a year now. And so we hope you'll join us a month from now to hear more about the findings and each of our leaders' thoughts on what we found and what we've learned. Thanks again, everyone, for being here with us today. Hope you have a great afternoon, and we'll look forward to seeing you on the first Wednesday in June, just a month from now. Thanks so much.